You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hi, my name is Robin Erickson, and I'm a principal researcher in the Human Capital Center at the Conference Board. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights, a podcast series brought to you by the Conference Board. And as you all know, as a result of COVID-19, U.S. organizations had to respond very quickly in February and March to protect the health and safety of their workers. Many organizations immediately required their knowledge workers to work remotely and laid off or had to furlough some workers. Many others have had to close their businesses, or at least temporarily. And the just released May 2020 jobs report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the unemployment rate is 13.3%. And while this is lower than in April and gives some optimism about recovery, it is still possible that these numbers could put the U.S. in the deepest recession since the Great Depression. So the Conference Board is committed to helping organizations navigate through this turbulent time. In addition to tracking the economic ramifications of COVID-19, the Conference Board has recently published 13 short reports covering many of the ways human capital has responded to the changing business environment in the context of their workforces. Today, my colleague and co-author, Frank Steemers, is joining me to discuss our recently published report, From Immediate Responses to Planning for the Reimagined Workplace, Human Capital Responses to COVID-19. This is one of the first reports to leverage survey data on this important topic. This report and all our COVID-related reports can be found on the Human Capital Curated Resources page of the Conference Board's COVID-19 Hub at www.conference-board.org. So hi, Frank. Could you tell us about the background of the report?
Yeah, of course. Hey, Robin. So what we wanted to do is to better understand the many lasting impacts of COVID-19 and its impact on work and human capital processes. We launched an online survey, which we opened on April 15th and then closed 2 weeks later on April 28th. So we had 152 human capital leaders from US-based organizations respond to our survey. And these were mostly executives from a large range of industries, but mostly in professional and business services, manufacturing, and the healthcare sector, making up 60%. So in our survey, the questions we focused on were questions like how human capital leaders were responding to COVID-19 in terms of actions that they had already taken and actions that they were expecting to take over the next 3 months. We asked them about their transition plan. And we were also interested in remote working and what expectations HR leaders have, what might happen to teleworking or working from home after this pandemic has ended. And I also would like to point out that throughout the report, we decided to compare two types of companies with mostly professional and office workers, and comparing those with companies that have mostly industry and manual services workers. So just for me to define this last group, then you need to think of production, transportation, construction, but also food services, building, ground cleaning, healthcare support, and personal care, which makes up the manual services workers.
Thanks for that overview, Frank. As you mentioned, the survey results provided us with 3 overarching themes. The first is that prior to returning to the workplace, most organizations are prioritizing workforce health and office safety. That's not surprising. The second overarching theme is that more employees are likely to work remotely after the COVID-19 pandemic. And the third theme is that most employers have already implemented some form of workforce cost reductions, and many plan to continue to do so in the next 1 to 3 months. So Frank, to get us started, in terms of transition plans, what were some of the findings?
So I think not surprisingly, what we found is that organizations were especially concerned with workplace health and office safety. So sanitation concerns, timing and sequencing the return of workers, and addressing health concerns were by far the most common issues that are being focused on by these human capital leaders. So we actually had nearly 90% of them selecting these choices. Then also similarly, we asked respondents to rank their top 5 most significant human capital changes during the recovery phase. And this was out of a list of 20 options. So to talk about the first 4 changes that organizations are planning to make, we found that they mostly revolve around workplace safety. So they talked about remote working methods, like how can we incorporate this into our business, disaster recovery plans, office design, but also HR policies, especially regarding flexibility, pay time off, and vacation.
And something that I found particularly interesting was the fifth biggest concern, right after the ones you just mentioned, right after the immediate workplace safety issues. Employee engagement came up as the next biggest concern. It was number 5. And this paints the picture that right after securing immediate workplace safety, organizations are most concerned with their employees' needs and well-being. And, this isn't surprising from the perspective that the benefits of employee engagement are well documented. Increased productivity, higher retention, decreased absenteeism are all effects of higher employee engagement. But this finding also reflects the monumental toll that's being taken by COVID-19 on employees, many of whom have had to upend their professional lives by working from home in less than optimal circumstances. They're being required to work on the front lines during a contagious pandemic. Some are being laid off or furloughed, or their family members are being laid off or furloughed. Others are being forced to work fewer hours. And all of these situations have been exacerbated by the extreme effects of COVID-19 in terms of employees' personal lives. There's been contradictory medical information, stay-at-home lockdowns and isolation, social distancing, the need to wear face masks, the closure of daycare and schools, just to name a few. So we expect in the long term that COVID-19 will have many far-reaching impacts on the world of work, and we look forward to sharing those with you as we do additional research.
Okay. So Robin, of course, I know that you're speculating here, and that is also sometimes the best we can do because there's so much uncertainty. But can I ask you, what do you think some of those potential impacts may be that could actually change the world of work?
Sure. Well, from the crisis research that I've done in the past, and from what I'm hearing our members discuss, there's a number of things that I think are going to happen. The first is that organizations that don't treat their employees well during a crisis will face lowered employee engagement. And this in turn will lead to increased voluntary turnover once employees can find alternative jobs. And obviously right now, with many companies who've actually had to do hiring freezes, it's harder to find a job. But everything that happens now in an organization, is noticed and will matter. There's also the issue that organizations are starting to wonder how long this crisis goodwill. I think whenever there's a big crisis, we see it with natural disasters. You see it with other huge crises like 9/11. There's this crisis goodwill and everyone sort of bands together. And I think there are a number of organizations that are starting to wonder how long this crisis goodwill can last. We're entering the 4th month of COVID-19 here in the U.S., and organizations are telling us that they can't continue paying workers full-time and not getting full-time work in return. At least they can't do it indefinitely. And so they're trying to figure that out. Another thing is that managers aren't sure when they can expect their employees to meet their goals. At what point in their one-on-one conversations do they go from, "Are you okay? Is everything all right?" to, "Are you delivering on your goals?" And then what do the managers do about the employees who aren't delivering or meeting goals? Another issue is that many employees who have been working remotely are burned out because there's no delineation between work and home. And there's been nowhere to go or disconnect when they're not working at home under stay-at-home orders. And then on similar note, many employees are realizing that they can't continue to do it all. They can't continue to work full-time and take care of children or elders full-time. And they're wondering if they must choose their family and leave the workforce. And unfortunately, we're seeing that this might be a decision that may be made more by women. And it's sad to me as a woman, but also just since we've been trying to find equality for women in the workforce here, especially in the U.S. There's also the issue of privacy, because many employees are concerned about being required to return to the workplace before a vaccine because of previously undisclosed health risks, and are thinking, do I need to leave the workforce? because I don't feel safe returning. And then last but definitely not least, the last 3 months have taken a significant mental health toll. And we're just starting to feel the effects. And just like the military has had to cope with post-traumatic stress syndrome, I do believe that we're going to start to see, especially with organizations who've had frontline workers, but also with their other employees who have had so much happening, so much turbulence and tumult in their lives. So those are some of the things that I think we're going to see and that we'll start to need to start researching.
Okay, Robin, no, these are really excellent points and very interesting. And of course, a lot to think about for human capital leaders. So just at this point, I think in our program, we're going to take a very short break for some quick announcements, and we'll be right back in a minute to discuss the latest insights on COVID-19, the human capital responses, and the planning to return to the workplace.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello again. I'm Robin Erickson with the Conference Board. Welcome to the second half of our podcast, and thanks for joining my colleague Frank and me as we discuss how organizations are planning to return to the workplace and the changes that they expect upon a return. One of our report's main insights pertains to the increase in remote working as a result of COVID-19. And in fact, we predict that an increase in remote working might become one of the most influential legacies of COVID-19. So Frank, tell our listeners what we found out in terms of remote working.
Right, so post-crisis, we expect that the remote working rates are likely to remain above pre-pandemic rates. So what we found in our survey is that 77% of our respondents expected an increase in workers that primarily work from home, which we defined as workers that work at least 3 days a week from home, and that this will be higher compared to the rates before the pandemic. We also found that actually some HR leaders expect that the share of teleworkers could be actually much higher. So 7 in 10 HR leaders expect to have at least 10% of their staff work from home, where before the pandemic, this was actually only 1 in 4. And of course, we know that some occupations groups, it will be easier. So think of information, technology, financial services, which of course lend themselves better for permanently high rates of remote working. But of course, I do also want to point out here, even though we expect a big increase in teleworking, these are of course expectations in very uncertain times. So for me, the most important takeaway here is that I think that many HR leaders have the intention to increase working from home and are also noticing that during this pandemic, with most workers now actually working from home, that it is actually not as bad as they might have expected. So, for example, we've also heard by talking to our members that some professional and office services firms aren't even planning to go back to their workplaces until there's a vaccine, also showing that many are perhaps pretty comfortable with how it is currently going. So let me also talk a little bit more about the consequences or possible consequences of a structural increase in remote working post-pandemic. So, of course, if a lot of workers are not going to their work anymore, that means that a lot fewer people will be going to city centers. So we in my team, me as an economist, we have been thinking about what might this mean for city centers. If people are not going anymore, then this of course also means that fewer people will be going to brick and mortar storefronts located in city centers. So consumer spending might be shifting from these city centers to more residential areas. So maybe for retail shops, food services, they might want to consider diversifying their geographical portfolio, of course, if they can. And we have already seen this with many restaurants, for example, now adding delivery and takeout to the options of their restaurant.
Well, and as we look ahead, there's also many other potential implications of more remote work. First of all, organizations will need to invest in IT infrastructures and equipment that supports remote work. New work from home and flexibility policies will need to be created. What's reasonable to expect from remote employees? What should the organization provide or pay for example, for Wi-Fi or monitors, printers, or cell phones? In fact, I just recently read about Google's going to provide all of their workers $1,000 as a budget to fix up their work from home environment. But the tenor of work itself will change because managers and employees are going to need to develop the new skills of how to build virtual relationships, to effectively accomplish projects, and to build camaraderie. Think about people who are new to the organization and how much more difficult it will be for them to get to know their colleagues. So the HR processes that are typically done in person, they're going to need to adapt to virtual processes. For example, performance management, learning and development, recruiting, and onboarding. And, there are a few positives, but one of those is that organizations will be able to acquire talent regardless of where they live, simply because they won't be tied to one regional area. And this should improve the quality of hire. So, Frank, when we were looking at our results, we found that the shift to remote working also has productivity implications. Why don't you tell everyone about those?
Yeah, of course. So interestingly, we found that companies that already had a large share of remote workers were actually likelier to experience increased productivity. So of course, this makes sense. If you already have more workers inside your company that work from home, the shift is easier than for companies that were just not used to it at all. In addition, we found, of course, that there were some differences for different types of companies. So for the industry and manual services organizations, we found that they were more likely to report declines in productivity. On the other hand, for the professional and office organizations, it seems they have been able to continue without too many changes. And so they were also more likely to report no change in productivity. Here I do want to point out, though, that interestingly, a small portion of our sample actually self-reported an increase in productivity. And here we actually saw a slightly higher share of industry manual services organization representing this increase. So we think that this is most likely due to an increased demand for these essential products and some of these services. So here you need to think of online retailers, package delivery, and maybe some healthcare corporations, but also large grocery stores. So besides remote working, we also looked at differences between the industry manual services organizations and compared them to the professional and office organizations. And we found that it was not just productivity that was different. And this is actually bringing now us to the other big theme in our survey, and that is that for these different types of companies, the workforce cost reduction strategies were actually different. So, of course, we saw that almost all of our survey respondents have implemented hiring freezes, hiring restrictions, and this, of course, to cut workforce costs. But we found that a greater percentage of industry and manual services organizations have had to make additional cost reductions. So everywhere we have also professional office companies have been making, for example, wage cuts, furloughs, they have been deferring bonuses, but the share was much smaller compared to industry and manual services organizations. And this is also interesting because it is kind of in line with the latest data that we got from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Their latest report with May data showed that young workers, Hispanics, women, and those with less education are being hit the hardest as a result of COVID-19. And we know that these groups of workers also make up the majority of workers in manual services. So some other interesting insights, I would say, from these workforce cost reduction strategies is that we found that organizations responded to the crisis first with actions that are relatively easy to implement and perhaps also more easy to reverse. So think of deferring pay increases, bonuses, reducing hours worked, freezing hiring, implementing furloughs. And we were actually surprised to find out that at the end of April, less than 10% of organizations had already conducted permanent layoffs or had implemented a major restructuring of the organization. So, of course, in our survey, we didn't only ask what they already had done, but we also asked what the expectations were for the next 3 months. So, Robin, can you maybe say some more about that, and what cost reduction actions do we still expect to happen?
Sure, Frank. We actually found that 2 of the more drastic measures, permanent layoffs and organizational restructurings, are more likely to occur over the next 3 months. And for the sake of the survey, it was May, June, and July. And that means that despite the historically high levels of unemployment, we actually should be bracing for more layoffs to come. And we expect that some of the organizational restructurings will actually occur during bankruptcy procedures, many of which have already been announced. For example, J.Crew, JCPenney, Neiman Marcus, Pier 1. And not surprisingly, those organizations that had declining revenues before COVID-19, or those that don't expect to recover in 12 months, they needed to use more. They were much more likely to use layoffs or major restructuring. And that just makes sense. If their revenues were already declining or they didn't think they could come back, they had to lay off more people earlier on and to use major restructurings. So as we think about the conclusion here, Frank, we've discussed a number of insights from our COVID-19 Human Capital Survey. In terms of a concluding thought, what surprised you the most about the survey findings?
So I think what surprised me quite a lot, that at the end of April at least, that some organizations were pretty optimistic about the recovery from COVID-19, with actually more than 55% of the HR leaders expecting to return to pre-COVID-19 revenue levels within the next 12 months. So that is before April 2021. And I think that even though it's maybe surprising, the takeaway from this for me is that it provides us with a reminder that the COVID-19 recession will be devastating for the industries and small businesses most disrupted by the social distancing, but perhaps less so for many other industries. And of course, the jury is still out there. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that we should keep in mind that with consumers being hit, a lot of firms being hit, that it might be more difficult to go back to pre-COVID-19 revenue levels that some HR leaders might expect. Maybe today they would already respond differently to this question. But I think it is maybe a positive thing to keep in mind, and maybe to also end up with another positive note, is that we actually saw a decline in the unemployment rate, as you already mentioned, Robin, in May compared to April. So hopefully this path of recovery will continue over the coming months. So with that, this brings us to the end. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast and have now a better idea of the current landscape post-COVID-19. As Robin already mentioned earlier, this report is available to the public on our Human Capital Curated Resource page of the Conference Board's COVID-19 Hub, which you can find on conferenceboard.org. Let me also add that for other podcasts or webcasts, if you would like to find out more, please visit our website at conferenceboard.org/podcast or conferenceboard.org/webcast, where you can find more interactive programs. You can also find, of course, our podcast on other platforms like iTunes or Spotify. So thanks again and goodbye.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.